Chapter 1. Pedro meets Sandra. The story begins with a young man called Pedro, looking for a job in the tough corners of Italy. Pedro is a qualified chef, but for the past year now, he has been unable to get a job. One normal Thursday, as Pedro is on his daily job hunt, he hears a scream from a woman coming from the nearby corridor. So Pedro picks up some rocks and rushes in that direction. On arrival, he sees a woman, approximately in her 40s, held at gunpoint by two masked men. Pedro has great aim, so he aimed at the eyes of the two masked men and used his stones to hit their eyes from a safe position where they couldn't shoot him. When the two masked men were distracted, focusing on their eyes, Pedro shouted at the woman to run his way while he kept distracting the men with more stones. Pedro and the woman then ran to a different corridor, where they managed to hide till the masked men left. The woman was thankful and asked Pedro how she could repay him. Pedro told the woman that he was a qualified chef looking for a job and asked her to help him get one. The woman told Pedro that, at the moment, it would take time and asked Pedro if he could drive. Pedro answered that yes, he could drive. The woman then said to Pedro that she could get him a driving job that paid better than that of a chef. Pedro agreed to the job and said yes. The woman then introduced herself officially, saying her name was Sandra, and asked Pedro for his name. After the introduction, she told him to look for her on Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Palvanar Resort, room number 25. Pedro agreed and shook hands with Sandra, after which Sandra took a taxi and left. Sunday was 2 days away, so Pedro decided to use the 2 days to get a driving license. Sadly, he could not get the license since he lacked the needed money, but he still had hope that Sandra would help with that. Finally, Sunday had arrived, and Pedro arrived at Palvanar Resort and headed to room 25 and knocked. The door was opened, and he saw Sandra waiting for him, and this time she had 5 masculine bodyguards. Sandra welcomed him to the sofa, where he saw a contract on the table. Sandra then said she was happy working with people like Pedro and asked Pedro to pick up the contract and read it. The contract was an agreement between Pedro and the Sufficient Organization, in short, TSO. The contract required a copy of Pedro's national ID, passport, and phone numbers. Pedro lacked a passport, but Sandra assured him to relax and keep on reading the contract. The TSO contract demanded confidentiality between them and Pedro, and once it was signed by Pedro, he couldn't terminate the agreement in future until his 20-year contract expired. The payment was also indicated in the contract, and it was a good weekly pay. So he signed the contract, and one of Sandra's guards took photos and videos of Pedro signing the contract. Sandra then asked him for his ID and told him that she hoped he wrote down his numbers in the contract. He said yes, and Sandra then said to him that he would find his ID and passport in his first delivery car. Pedro said that it was okay. Sandra then told him that he now worked for TSO, which was a well-organized gang with powerful leaders who had power in the government. She continued by saying the men he saved her from were rival gang members who were trying to get TSO secrets from her. She told Pedro that TSO chose him because he helped save her and TSO secrets. Finally, she told him that TSO is good to those loyal to them and dangerous to the disloyal ones. But if he followed the rules, all was good. Pedro was shocked and asked Sandra why she didn't tell him before he signed. Sandra told him to relax and not fear because his job only dealt with transport, but for safety, he would be given a gun for any time he needed self-defense, as the work could be risky sometimes. Sandra could see Pedro panicking, but she gave him a card with her number and told him to save it and only call when the matter was urgent. She also gave him a card with the TSO number and told him that was the number to be used when communicating between TSO and him. Sandra then ordered food for Pedro, and when the food arrived, she told Pedro to enjoy and relax and that the job would begin on Tuesday. Sandra then left with her guards. Pedro was left panicking, so he ordered the food to be packed for him as takeaway, and after, he went back home to think. My Lost Love continues in Chapter 2, so stay tuned to find out what happens.